All right.
There you go.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have to apologize because we've gotten off schedule a little bit, and so we're trying to right that now. We've finished all of the lectures for the first unit, which means that it's time for a test, and ideally we would be reviewing for that test today and then have it open on Blackboard for you all to take. The test is going to be a little bit different than the quizzes because we'll be using the Blackboard tool that basically locks down the browser so that you cannot use, really, ideally the PowerPoint presentation during the test. However, if you want to print those out or you want to make any notes on them, that's fine. That's just kind of a way to make sure you know the material rather than are just looking it up during the test. The test will be timed, but we'll give you 2 hours to complete it. Hoping to do review today, but I realized that for quiz 3, I set the due date as this Wednesday, and also for 4 and 5, I made the quizzes but did not actually make them available to you. So I fixed that this morning. So quizzes 4 and 5 are open. However, in order to be able to review for them, we have to take them before Wednesday. So I know that's a lot to ask, but does that seem feasible to you all? Yeah, does anyone have any problem with that? No concerns? Okay. So here's the deal. I basically set up these quizzes and I removed the time limit from them. And also I made them a little bit on the easier side, less tricky questions. Like I mentioned last week, we had some issues there especially on quiz 2, some of those trickier questions. So it's a little bit on the easier side, a little bit more straightforward. You guys will need to take both quizzes 3, 4, and 5 by basically midnight on Tuesday morning / Wednesday, or Tuesday evening / Wednesday morning. And I could probably make that a little bit longer for you guys. There's no time limit on them, so you have time to look through and actually hopefully get the proper answers. Some of them are still a little cryptic, but they should be easier than the last quiz. All of that together should make it to where if you guys are able to finish those, we can review on Wednesday and then have the test open so we can move on to the next unit. Any questions about that?
How big of a window were you going to give for taking the test?
For the test, 1 week.
Okay, and that's going to start Wednesday or Thursday? When's it going to open up?
We'll open it up ideally Wednesday after class, after we review, and then we'll give you the week to take it to the following Wednesday. Does that sound good for people?
Okay. Is it going to be password protected?
Should we make it password protected?
Has Dixie told you about we're supposed to have a couple of proctored activities?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And I didn't know if this was going to be one of them. If it was, then yeah, we password protect it and make everybody come in. If not, you don't have to.
I'm thinking maybe for the first test, for this first unit, maybe we'll just kind of more of a traditional.
Okay.
And then we'll do the next 2 tests proctored. That way it'll make it a little bit easier on us for this first round if that works.
Okay, that's fine. Just if I need to send an email or do an announcement or something to Blackboard, either you or I do, to let everybody, online people know.
Yeah, sorry about the confusion there. This is kind of a different model for me. So the first time kind of doing more of a distance class. We've done hybrid stuff in the past. So this is the first time actually doing just distance, and it's a little bit different, but trying to get us caught up. Hopefully that will work. If anybody has any problems with it, please just let me know ahead of time. That way we can try to sort things out, get everything going in a timely manner. All right, so the next piece I wanted to talk about is our crop project, which again, a little bit behind on this as well, but the concept is basically everyone is going to select one crop, and we're going to do that through a discussion board forum. Let me show you my screen here just to show you. I got it, have it up here. You guys see that?
Yep.
All right, so again, you click on the discussion board frame there, and right here, crop project selection forum, and just go in here and create a thread stating which crop that you would like to focus on. And the idea here is that you all will be becoming kind of an expert in that crop of your choice. And it's going to be on a first come, first served basis. So you can hop on that forum, and if you already know what crop you want, go ahead and put that in there now. However, what I do want you all to do is to actually be as specific as possible. So, for instance, somebody could do corn, right? But you want to separate it into categories. So rather than just saying one person's just going to do corn, you would have one person maybe do field corn, but then allow someone to still do like sweet corn. Does that make sense to people? They're different crops, different marketing strategies, different growth, production, harvesting. It's different. So even though several people might select corn, you can do different types of corn. Or for instance, say someone like Yusuf is interested in doing tomatoes. Rather than just have one person do just tomatoes, if there are multiple people interested in tomatoes, you could select, say, sauce tomatoes or fresh market slicing tomatoes, or even salad tomatoes. And just being very specific about your crop project selection. Again, because they all have different harvesting techniques, different growth techniques. It's all a little bit different. So I want you guys to use this kind of as a springboard for your own potential crop production in the future. Use it to really maximize your educational benefit. And this is going to feed into another project. So this first project will kind of culminate in a written report displaying pretty much everything that you found out about the crop. And I'll be posting a rubric for that. Pretty much everything, really. I mean, a little bit about the history of the crop, where it came from, how it's typically propagated. Do we grow it by seed? Do we grow them from cuttings? Etc. Is it genetically engineered or modified? What are the different varieties of the crop type? How are they grown? So on and so forth. What are the harvesting indices for that crop? And I'm going to put up an example for you guys too, as well as the rubric. So you'll know exactly what we're looking for in terms of your crop project. The second part of the project is going to be actually teaming up with someone else to finish the project, and eventually you guys will be posting a presentation yourself so that everyone can learn all about these crops and the work that you all do. But we're going to team you guys up, and it might be kind of interesting. We're going to team you up based on the crops. And that might be crops that are very similar in some manners, but different in others. So this is it'll be a little bit of an experiment in actually conducting this. but I think that it should be a very rewarding experience for everyone. So for those of you that are in seats today, you might want to talk to other people if you want to work with someone in person. Some people are going to be doing it entirely online. And again, we're here to help with that. So please just let me know what issues you might have. If you need help trying to figure out how to make a presentation, all of that stuff. We'll start kind of the crop project together, and I'll get you an example of that as soon as I possibly can. And then as you guys start working on that, I'll assign the teams once everyone's kind of selected their crops and kind of started to work on it. So you'll know pretty soon that crop project team report will be kind of towards the end of the semester. And basically the last chapters in the book start to go over these different crops. And I mentioned kind of in the beginning of the class that I want you all to be looking through those, try to select your crop. There's lots of good information in those chapters, but we really don't have time to cover them all in detail. So we're using this crop project, both solo and with the team, as a way to kind of cover that material without actually spending time in class covering every single crop. So does that make sense to everyone? Everyone good there? Is anyone like getting on the forum right now and selecting their crop? Does anybody have any ideas for crops that they want to select? What do you want to work with? Carrie, I'm going to ask you.
I'll probably do corn.
Any particular kind of corn?
I'm not sure yet. I'll have to look into it.
The interesting thing about corn is that you could do, kind of more fresh market sweet corn. Excuse me. You could do grain corn, which could be for feed, or it could be for grinding for corn meal. Or you could potentially do things like silage. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at it. And, of course, everything is going to change based on which type you select. Anybody else?
I think I'm going to do tobacco.
Tobacco. Very good. And the thing with tobacco is, again, I mean, you could look at it as different types of tobacco and different harvesting techniques. I mean, so for instance, you got different grades of tobacco, right? If it's going into, say, cigarette production, it's different than tobacco that is going for cigar production. They have different harvest time, different techniques for harvest. So that's something to look at. Try to be more specific if possible, although in some cases that might, kind of develop as you go further along. So if there are multiple people that want to do tobacco, but you're not sure exactly which type to focus on, then.
So would I split it up, like either do bright tobacco or dark tobacco? Right.
That could be one way of splitting it up. So, I mean, you would just kind of select which one you're kind of more interested in working on. And I'm okay if someone wants to just do tobacco just generally and then go into the specific types. That's fine as well. But if we have multiple people wanting to do tobacco, then we'll have to get into a specific type. Also, I know Wyatt was interested in the cannabis plant, and you're welcome to do a report on that. But again, you would want to focus on whether you're looking at hemp production or, say, medical production, or perhaps recreational. I mean, it just depends on, what you're looking at. And then we might group you together. If someone chose, say, hemp and someone else chose medical, then you might be grouped together and looking at the similarities and the differences of that kind of crop production. Does anybody else have any other questions about the crop project? Everybody good? All right, so more details on that forthcoming. I think on quiz 3, I know this is my fault because I gave more time than I intended for it, but we've had a few people already take it, but most have not started it. So try to get on that as quickly as possible so that we can have a good review session on Wednesday for the test. All right, so we're going to be changing units here shortly, and really I'm just going to kind of start by kind of going over the general parts of the next unit in the book. I don't really want to get started on anything specifically today, considering that you guys are going to be kind of cramming for these quizzes and then studying for the test, so I don't want to lay anything out completely right now, but I just want to kind of do sort of a brief overview of kind of what we're looking at in Unit 2. It's getting a little bit more complex. You know, for Unit 1, we're really general. It's all of the, basics of, what goes into crop production. Unit 2 is a lot more extensive. We're going into the actual anatomy of plants, their structure, their chemistry, how they grow and develop. We're also going to be talking a little bit about genetics and biodiversity in the crops and some of the processes. So it's going to get really scientific, especially when we get into the nutrition part of it. So kind of wanted to see where you all are right now in terms of what you guys already know about plant structure, etc. So has everybody had kind of like a general biology class covering some of the stuff about general just plant shape and structure? Know that we all, I mean, obviously everyone knows what photosynthesis is, right? I mean, a lot of these really general topics we've covered in kind of classes leading up to this. And I don't want to get too specific into the actual chemistry and metabolism. I mean, we can have a whole class devoted to that. In fact, we do have whole classes devoted to that, especially in the higher education levels in your undergraduate and bachelor's programs, and as well as master's programs. We had a whole class on plant nutrition, and it gets really complex with how nutrients actually move through the plant. Really, I'm going to highlight kind of the areas that I think are most pertinent to you all in terms of a crop production standpoint, rather than getting into the very specifics of what enzymes and catalysts are responsible for transporting nutrients throughout plants. Instead, we're thinking more on the general level. So speaking of that, we all know that plants conduct photosynthesis, right? I mean, that's kind of how life happens on Earth, really. Plants absorb solar energy in the form of this electromagnetic radiation, and then they use that to kind of take up nutrients and water from the soil, which, of course, through the soil, again, we're not actually directly taking nutrients up. We're taking them up through water in the soil and how water moves through the soil, then into the plant. Plant transpires, and in that process, it's respiring. It's releasing its gases, but it's also kind of using the whole photosynthetic process as a way for the plant really to kind of breathe and actually grow. And that's really where plant growth occurs, is through respiration and transpiration. So it's part of photosynthesis, of course, but they actually have to be able to release the gases in order to actually put on any growth. And I think that's a concept that is kind of glossed over a lot in lower level biology courses. So thinking about that, that's how energy moves through ecosystems. And again, in agriculture, we are basically using kind of an ecosystem process, but we're using it to get a harvestable crop, something that we can actually get a yield from. Another thing that I kind of want to talk about in general, and something that you guys will need to focus on is kind of the scientific naming of plants, the binomial nomenclature, which you guys are all familiar with. Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. So a couple of you. Big thing that we're talking about here is how plants are classified. Really, it's the same as how all organisms are classified, all living things, through this taxonomy, basically. Does anybody know the name of the person that created the system that we use in classification of living organisms? It's kind of it's been a while. It's been like over 200 years. The guy Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, created this system of binomial nomenclature, and in doing so, he kind of created a sort of a simplified system initially that we've sort of expanded on throughout the years. And botanists, God bless them, I feel like they kind of try to change that. I mean, they need job security, right? So today, botanists are kind of changing the way plants are classified. Originally, it was based on the reproductive parts of the plants. So Linnaeus and other botanists basically looked through how plants are grouped together based on the shape of their flowers and seeds. And in many cases, they were absolutely correct. They didn't have molecular biology tools. Today, however, botanists are reclassifying a lot of those plants based on genomics, actually based on the genetic basis of the plants, the DNA, rather than just what they look like. And it's proving that Linnaeus was actually correct in many cases in his, kind of grouping of plants together. For instance, we have families, right? We got plant families such as the aster family, for instance. Big plant family that's blooming right now often. You see goldenrods, for instance, starting to bloom. Lots of daisies, sunflowers, etc. All these plants are kind of blooming, especially in temperate regions in the fall. But they have a very similar floral structure. They've got what we call composite flowers. They have both ray and bisque flowers, two flower types in one flower. Therefore, they grouped them together. Makes sense, right? And genetically, they are actually very similar. So Linnaeus was correct in that. But in some cases, they were way off. The flowers looked similar, but really the plants were not related very much at all. So this whole scientific classification is important in that we're grouping plants together by how they are related, but it's also by the way that they actually use chemicals, basically. They uptake similar nutrients if they're in the same family. They have similar mechanisms for doing that. For instance, if we think about one family of plants that we've talked about a few times now, the legumes, we know that legumes all are able to fix nitrogen, right? Or many of them, not every single one of them. But that's something that's kind of unique to that plant family. There are a couple other families that might be able to do some nitrogen fixation, but it's really the legume family that does most of that. So let's just talk just for a second about that, kind of the different classification types of plants. And really, again, all living organisms. So just share this. Does anybody know what the first, like, most general classification is? Kingdom, right? So we have 5 different kingdoms of life. And what kingdom do you think plants are in? Yeah, it's kind of a rhetorical question. They are in the plant kingdom, which we add an ending to that. They call it the plant A kingdom. And the only reason that they're doing this is basically because all this language is in Latin. And there are many reasons that we use Latin for this binomial nomenclature system. But the main reason, I think, really, is that Latin is a dead language, right? No one speaks Latin today. So therefore, the names are not really going to change that much. Also, it's an internationally recognized system, so that we can be talking to someone on another part of the world completely and actually see that we're using the same names. We're not using different languages. We're using kind of one international system. So what's the next step down? We go from kingdom, and then we get a little bit more specific to the
Phylum.
phylum. Yes, thank you.
Oh.
So on the phylum, do you guys know some of the phylums of plants? Went from very kind of simple plants to as they kind of evolved over time. So there's one phylum that most of our crops are in, and I don't want to say all of them because there are definitely crops that are in other phylums. But anybody know what it is? It's the Magnoliophyta. And phyta, again, is another one of these kind of Latin word endings, and it basically is just saying phylum. So the Magnoliophyta is the flowering plants. And most of our crops are in there, but there are definitely some exceptions. Couple of other phylums of plants that we might think of are like the Lycophyta, which are lycopods, the club mosses, or the Bryophyta, which are regular mosses. Plants started to develop a vascular system, meaning they were able to grow up. So all of the initial phylums, the very early simple plants, the mosses especially, the Bryophyta, they did not have a well-developed vascular system, where do mosses generally grow? Where do you see them growing? Kind of looking at the microclimate.
In wet, shady spots.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. In wet and shady spots. And that's because they don't have a vascular system to be able to transport water up into the plant. The other issue is that they reproduce by spores instead of seeds, right? They don't flower and make seeds. Instead, they reproduce from spores. Spores have to have moisture in order to be able to actually be fertilized and then create new plants. So again, it's a very simple plant. As plants evolve, they first developed this vascular system so they could transport water and nutrients upward, so that it allowed them to get bigger. So just put down an example here. We got the Bryophyta, the mosses, and then a step up from there, another phylum would be the Pterophyta, which is ferns, right? And ferns, kind of the same thing, right? They generally grow in kind of shady, moist areas, but they did develop a vascular system, so they're able to grow larger, but not quite as big as the more advanced plants. And again, they have to be in shady, moist areas because they're reproducing from spores. We'll fast forward a few, really million years here to the Magnoliophyta. That's all of our flowering plants. There were different kind of links in there between the different phyla, such as the Coniferophyta, for instance. The conifers, all the conifers basically were moving up, right? They're trees, many of them, and shrubs. They're woody plants, developed woody tissues, but also had a container for their seeds. So they're not quite flowering yet, but they're still kind of just, they're called gymnosperms, right? So gymnosperm literally means naked seed. It's in a cone enclosed, but it doesn't have a fruit enclosing it like the flowering plants. And again, basically anything that has a seed inside of it is technically, botanically speaking, a fruit. And some of those things we don't really think of as fruits. And I mean, even botanically, they have a different word for it. But for instance, like corn, you know, it's a naked grain. It's not a seed enclosed in a fleshy fruit, but it's a seed enclosed in a husk. The next kind of categories here in taxonomic classification, we went from kingdom to phylum, then we go to class. Then order. And really, we don't talk, especially in our plant classes, we don't really talk that much about class and order as much because they're really broad and kind of difficult classifications that botanists use to, I mean, it's kind of superfluous. There are subclasses and superclasses and suborders and superorders. And then they have, you know, other little kind of delineations in there to separate different types of plants. So we're going to kind of just gloss over and kind of skip over class and order. Just know that those are different classification systems. And go to the most important, I think anyway, especially for your projects. Family. And then what comes after the family?
Genus.
Genus and
Species.
the species. So let's look at a plant family or a couple of plant families and some patterns real quick. I'm going to open up a little PowerPoint for you guys here. This is basically looking at kind of this tree of life here. Everybody see that? Again, so we're looking at the plant kingdom and how they kind of evolved over time. So started with algae, then they developed into seedless, non-vascular plants, kind of further developed into seedless, vascular plants, then into gymnosperms, which have seeds, plants with cones, and then into the flowering plants. And then we have, basically in here, we have different orders and different families. And I just wanted to talk about how these families are grouped together for a second, why they're grouped together, and some of the patterns that they have. So first we have the carrot or parsley family, which is known in the Latin, kind of the binomial nomenclature, as the Apiaceae. And the interesting thing about this plant is if we look, or this plant family, is if we look at the shapes of the flowers, they're all in umbels. And more recently, botanists started to call it the Apiaceae. That was like kind of in the 60s when they changed that from what used to be called the Umbelliferae family. And it's because these flowers are in umbels. Now, what do you think that looks like this kind of umbel flower. Remind you of the shape of anything? No? Kind of reminds me of an umbrella, right? So you think of Apiaceae, all of these flowers in this family have this kind of umbrella shape. And they have basically almost always a cluster of flowers. Rather than one singular flower, it's a large cluster. So each one of these in this parsley flower is an individual flower. The flower is pollinated, turns into a seed, right? And that seed is this two-celled fruit. The aster family that I mentioned earlier, you've probably seen these blooming now. Kind of throughout temperate parts of the world, the asters kind of really come in late summer and early fall. And they all have this same kind of composite flower with a disc flower and a ray flower. However, there are many cases, such as like a chicory flower, that do not have both types. They have one or the other. They're either all disc flowers or all ray flowers, but they're still composites. They still kind of have that daisy or sunflower shape. And they make the same types of seeds. Dandelion is a good one to think of because they have these, what we call pappus, things that basically allow for the dispersal of the plants. So the pappus is kind of its parachute, how it flies on the wind. Another important plant family is the mustard family or the Brassicaceae. This family has 4 petals. All the flower parts are in 4s, and it's in this cross shape. So they generally, again, they changed the names of the families kind of in the early 60s. But it used to be called the crucifer family because it's a cross-shaped flower because it's got 4 flower parts. And a lot of our kind of we call them cold crops, cabbage, broccoli, kales, they're all in this family. They all have pretty much the same kind of seed type. It's a pod. They have different shapes, but it's a very thin pod that tends to be dry and has the seeds in the center and kind of lined up in a row. Next family, another very large family, the Fabaceae or legume family. Some patterns in it are that it has an irregular flower, and we call it the banner, wing, and kill, the 3 different flower parts. They also have often bean or pea-like pods for the container for the seeds, and generally have composite leaves as well, compound leaves, rather than having simple leaves. And this family is home to most of the nitrogen-fixing plants, so it can be very important for many forms of agriculture, whether it's pasture or even just field growing. They make excellent cover crops. Another family is the mint family, the Lamiaceae, which all mints have this square stem. And a lot of our herbs are in the mint family, things like sage, mint, of course, peppermint, spearmint, oregano, thyme, they're all in this mint family. They all have square stems. They also have an irregular flower. Looks kind of similar to like a bean flower, but it's a little bit different. Generally has a longer tube. And these are all growing in clusters in the mint family, whereas bean flowers often are more solitary. Another plant family is the Liliaceae, lily family, and they're different in that they're monocots. And monocots and dicots are it's a totally different category classification system. It's basically the big thing that I look at in monocots and dicots is the venation of the leaf, as well as how many cotyledons. So the cotyledon is the seed leaf when a seed germinates, comes up. Monocots have, guess what? one leaf when they pop up. Dicots have two. So we have crops that are important in both of them. Very similar family to the lily family is the grass family. Same parallel venation, but totally different flowers. Finally, the rose family, the Rosaceae, they have flower parts in fives. So especially the petals and sepals, you always see them in numerals of fives. A lot of important crops in the Rosaceae family as well. Almost all of our fruit trees, not every single fruit tree, but almost all of our temperate fruit trees are in this family. Apples, pears, plums, peaches, cherries, they're all in the Rosaceae family. All right, so anyway, that's just a little bit about some of the plant families and their patterns. Just wanted to mention that briefly and kind of show you some of the things and how they were classified for that. So let's just take a particular plant and kind of talk about its classification for just a minute. Let's just say corn, for instance. Corn, anybody know what family corn is in? You can be general. It's in the Poaceae family, which is the grass or grain family. And basically all of our, grasses or grains are in that family. So agriculturally, it's extremely important family. And it's kind of interesting because you look at corn and it doesn't really look like a grass, does it? Maybe to some of you it might, but when it pops up, when it comes out, that first cotyledon, it does look like a blade of grass. As it develops, of course, it begins to look much more different. Gets really tall. Of course, we do have some grasses that get really tall too. Don't necessarily think of it as grass as what we think as like turf grass. Yeah, our turf grasses are in this family, but so are our grains. So it's a little bit different. So let's take the genus and species, and this is where we really get into the Latin. Corn is Zea mace is the scientific name. And again, this is in, it's in Latin, right? And why is it in Latin? One, so it doesn't get confusing. The names do not change as much. The meanings change. If we were putting it in English, it changes all the time, right? We're always adding new words to the English language. So Latin doesn't change. That's why we're using it for this botanical classification. This is where we get the binomial nomenclature. So generally, we're looking at the genus and species when we talk about plants. Genus is written, is written first. So Zea is the corn genus, and there are a couple of other species in that genus. Genus is always capitalized, and if you're typing it, you italicize it. If you're handwriting it, you underline it. Maize is the species. Species names are always in lowercase. However, you guys may know that we can have additions to that. There are lots of different ways that we could look at Zea mays, for instance. Let's think of it a cultivated variety or a cultivar. Anybody have a good corn cultivar? For those of you that grow it as grain, it just might be a hybrid like Pioneer number F81 or something like that. Cultivated varieties are always written using single quotation marks, and they're both capitalized. So I'm more of a sweet corn kind of guy myself. So I'm just going to talk about one of my favorites here. Honey Select would be a cultivated variety. And we would write that again in single quotation marks and capitalize both words that are enclosed in those quotation marks. Honey Select Excellent Sweet Corn. So notice that we don't actually put any scientific classification of sweet corn versus field corn, although there is a lot of science involved in that. Basically, they have different genetics that allow for a different sugar content in the seeds. So anyway, that's our cultivated variety, or cultivar, how we would write that. So anyway, when we're actually doing our plant projects, this is something I want you guys to do first of all. Tell us what the classification, what is the taxonomic classification of the plant? And again, you don't have to do really anything in terms of kingdom. We know it's in the plant kingdom, right? We don't need to know what the class or order is, but we definitely want to know what family and genus and species they are. So that might be something that you start off looking at for your selected crop. All right, I know we're pretty much out of time, so just want to open that up for any questions. I'm going to post this little plant family patterns PowerPoint for you guys to refer back to. You guys go ahead and be looking at those final chapters of the book, and especially once you selected a crop. Go ahead and get on that discussion board forum and sign up for your particular crop. Anybody have any questions, comments, or concerns? Gripes or grievances? No? Okay, cool. Well, again, if you have any questions, you have any problems, just let me know ahead of time. Sorry for this kind of packing this in there, but quizzes 3, 4, and 5 due on Wednesday. They're simpler, they're easier, they're open now. Let me know if you have any problems. On that note, we'll sign off. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you again on Wednesday.
Okay. Bye, everybody.